Hello, listeners. Before we get going this week, here's a great offer for you, and it's exclusive to listeners of The Week Unwrapped. You can get 6 free issues of The Week magazine and a free pair of headphones using our offer code podcast. Just go to dennismags.co.uk/theweek and enter the offer code podcast. And for that, you get your 6-week free trial and free headphones. Crikey. Now here's the show. It's the week ending Saturday, the 10th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a Russian spy and his daughter poisoned by a chemical weapon in the south of England, President Trump threatening a trade war with the rest of the world, and The Shape of Water winning Best Picture at the Oscars. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Jamie Timson, Kari, Wilkin, and from the week junior, it's Felicity, Capon. Let's start the show this week with Jamie. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week where an election brought unrest and nationalist fervour again.
Mohammed Fazal's brother Abdul died in their burning home, one of many set alight.
Early morning today, I came to inside the house to check with my parents. That time I saw my brother, he was fell down in the floor near the bathroom.
The attacks were sparked by the death of this man, H.D. Kumarasinghe. The 41-year-old Sinhalese driver was beaten by 4 reportedly drunk Muslim youths for not allowing them to overtake his vehicle. Days later, he was dead.
Al Jazeera's Minal Fernandez, and before that Mohammed Isham, describing a wave of anti-Muslim attacks that have hit Sri Lanka this week. Jamie, why have you chosen Sri Lanka as your story of the week?
So Sri Lanka has been put into a state of emergency this week, which is the first time since their bloody civil war ended in 2009. A bit of a history lesson, I guess.
Yes, please.
My trademark Timson history lessons.
Sure, I could do with it. Sri Lanka, not top of my knowledge, I'll be honest.
It was part of the British Empire. It was given independence. After independence from British rule, there was quite a big divide between the 70% majority Sinhala nationalists, who are all Buddhists, and the Tamils, who are a mixture but mainly Muslim. The Sinhala kind of nationalists were resentful of what they saw as kind of British favouritism towards Tamils, and a civil war eventually broke out. The main strong man who eventually crushed the Tamils, but there was a long-running civil war. The strong man who eventually kind of crushed the Tamils and the civil war came to an end, he is the Sinhala nationalist Mahinda Rajapaksa. After that, the civil war ended. There was a kind of period of peace, stability,
That's peace in inverted commas, really, isn't it?
Peace, yes, yeah. Which has now seen itself rear its ugly head following an election last month where this guy, this strongman, he'd recently been deposed as leader of the country, and he's come back. He's a nationalist. He's been accused of human rights abuses,
and
corruption.
He's a Buddhist as well.
He's a Buddhist, yeah. Not your typical Buddhist,
well,
I admit.
I hate to be really naive about this, because obviously you've got the situation in Myanmar as well, and, there are obviously international situations involving Buddhists fighting, but it does seem immediately a contradiction that is at odds with how we tend to think of Buddhism in the West.
Yes, and I think it's probably more to do with the ideas of majority, and in any country where there's a 70% majority who feel somewhat hard done by, religious tension will occur. 90% of the Buddhist Sinhalese population are peace-loving and the kind of Buddhists that we know, but there is a 10% that do feel somewhat hard done by, and this week has been a kind of wave of anti-Muslim attacks, which, people are saying at least that the army and the police force are afraid of intervening in, because of the election last month, a local election in which this former strongman and human rights abuses won, his party won a kind of victory in the face of the government.
Kari, do you agree this is a significant story of the week, because like we've been saying, Sri Lanka, okay, they've sort of been at peace for 10 years, but it has been bubbling under the surface for really our whole lifetime.
I think this unrest certainly has major implications in that it's further destabilised the already shaking ruling coalition in Sri Lanka. So obviously you could have a complete change of government there if it completely falls apart and this anti-Muslim former president gets back in power. Also, a lot of this resentment, as I understand it, has been fuelled by resentment of Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar coming into Sri Lanka. So obviously that all ties into that. So you've got this bubbling cauldron and it's spreading, you could argue, across the whole region.
There are lots of parallels with, what we've seen in Italy and the UK in the past months. Here is an election that kind of stoked up nationalists further because of immigrants like the Rohingya coming down. It is a story that seems to be being replayed across the globe.
Yeah.
I think also there are sort of patterns with how the authorities are trying to deal with the crackdown that you see elsewhere. So the idea that access to social media sites has just been massively clamped down, which I always find slightly worrying, but they're saying this is all this sort of anti-Muslim hate and vitriol is being spread online. So there's been this immediate clampdown on social media, which again I always find slightly sinister.
Why? I mean, I know that we sort of think of social media as part of our freedom of expression now, but it sounds likely, doesn't it, that if there is a groundswell of support that's leading to anti-Muslim activity, that might be being spread by social
absolutely.
media.
I don't deny that there is anti-Muslim hatred, which is fueling these attacks. I think that is probably the case, but I think it's then a very easy excuse and justification for the authorities to get rid of an essential freedom that you've seen in other countries around the world and other conflicts, which has been used as a weapon of the state.
I think also, you have to think that, like, obviously in the UK and the West, we have ideas of what journalism is and things like that. But citizen journalism is a huge thing in Sri Lanka. You have lots and lots of people on the ground who do report and send images and stuff like that. And it removes or it stops a way for journalists to get information out there if you do clamp down on social media and ways of discussion like that.
Well, I don't know if you saw this story as well this week, that the far-right party in Italy were thanking Facebook for their result in the election. And there's obviously a sense that social media can stoke those sorts of divisions, but at the same time, maybe it just makes them more visible. I mean, maybe it is just actually reflecting how the population are thinking and feeling, which arguably is what it's supposed to do.
But it also spreads that message to a wider audience. It's revolutionised the way that the world communicates, and we're still getting to grips with it and how we should be dealing with that and what controls, if any, we should have on it. It's still very much early stages in that sense.
We can talk about how much we want Sri Lanka to continue on in peace and things. But one of the areas that I think was interesting was that there was a lot of this stems from the empire and our role in Sri Lanka. And there was a recent poll that showed 59% of the UK still think of the empire as a good thing. A third of the UK want it to still exist. Why is that? Why do we still think of the empire as a good thing when we surely do realise how much horrible...
Felicity is prepared to answer that one.
I wonder whether it's also the idea that there were positive things, there were some great things that came out of it, which you can't deny, but I also wonder whether it's more...
Name them. What are the things we can't deny?
Well, like
train
travel
lines.
Networks across India and
railways.
trade and that old chestnut. But I think it's more the case that a lot of people probably feel that they have a responsibility, and I know that sounds horribly patronising, but whatever you think of the empire, we did have a huge impact on these countries and nations, and there's probably it's the same with the aid budgets. You still feel like you have a responsibility to these countries to check what's going on there. Like you can't just sort of cut off your history like that.
Can I be cynical and suggest
Yes,
it's
please.
also because we like power and we don't have much power, and we're losing it with even more so every day with Brexit, and I think we would just like to feel important in the world again.
I think it's also kind of shocking that we just don't get taught that much about it. Our history is really looks at either very in-depth, from what I've learned at school, of like Tudors or 19th century politics or whatever, or it's kind of macro of like how we beat the Germans. But there's no look at, like, beyond maybe a little bit of kind of abolition of slavery and the building, obviously, of those great railways. We don't really have a kind of that much of a knowledge or taught about the kind of bad things. It's why people are always shocked when you talk about things like Sri Lanka, or you talk about even things like Ireland, and people are surprised of our history there. And so I guess that's why, maybe perhaps people still think of it in quite a good light.
Can I posit another theory as to if it is true that a large proportion of Brits are in favour of the empire? The Queen. Doesn't it tally with entrenched love for the monarchy in this country? And actually, almost you could argue the deliberate fudging of the empire into the Commonwealth, which is seen as a positive thing. Commonwealth Games, Commonwealth Intercountry Cooperation. I mean, really, that is a new label for what used to be the empire, isn't it?
I think the two do get confused when people say they want an empire, they actually want a more powerful Commonwealth, and they're not actually thinking about what the original implications of the empire were. They're just talking more about having a global influence.
But the Commonwealth countries also want the Queen as their head of state. I mean, a lot of them.
Some.
Not all of them.
Not
Most,
all of them, but
maybe.
a lot of them do.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see what happens when
No,
Charles
but
gets
I'm not
it.
saying. I'm not
True,
saying.
everyone will change their mind, won't they?
I'm not making an opinion about whether the Commonwealth is a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying it has, and I think this was partly the purpose of it as a PR effort, it has fudged what empire was into this thing that's seen as a positive cooperative movement. So when you ask the question, what do you think of the empire, people might be thinking,
What do you think of the Queen?
exactly, yeah, isn't it great that the Queen goes to Canada? That's not the question.
She kind of gives a sanitised face to the empire. You know, it's a nice old lady shaking people's hands. It's not,
Prince Charles has not got a sanitised face.
No, they're in major trouble.
Well, on that, Kari, the sanitised face of the week unwrapped, you are next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think it'll be the week we ask, should health officials put a cork in it?
It prompted French doctors to write a tribune in the French paper Le Figaro yesterday, telling the president that distinguishing between alcohol and wine is not doing anyone any favors. Now, this dates back to his comments at last month's Paris Agricultural Fair, where the French president admitted drinking, I quote, glasses of wine at lunch and dinner. He basically said, it's a blight on public health when people binge on alcohol or beer, but with wine, it's a different thing. It's not the same thing.
Deepthika Laurent speaking on France 24's paper review this week. So, Kari, the news is that President Macron likes a glass of wine at lunch and at dinner. What is the big news there?
It's more the response, the anger it's provoked. 9 leading French doctors this week wrote an open letter to Le Figaro newspaper, basically criticising Macron, saying he's endangering the health of the French people, and also saying he could actually end up in court on charges of failing to protect the nation from alcohol-related diseases.
Okay, this is what he actually said. I've got it written in front of me. He said, translated obviously, he said, I drink wine for lunch and dinner. There is a public health scourge when young people get drunk at an accelerated rate with strong drinks or beer, but they don't do so with wine.
That's an interesting opinion. Yeah, and these doctors are pointing out quite rightly that wine is an alcohol like any other. And actually, this all began when the French health minister last month made a statement that drinking too much wine, like any other alcohol, was bad for health. And this caused a major outcry, with other cabinet colleagues pointing out that wine and spirit exports generated almost 13 billion for the French economy last year. So obviously they've got a major vested interest in not putting out this message. But it's created this huge divide in France between people are saying, health officials who are calling for a national alcohol plan, and wine lovers like Macron who were saying this is part of winos who were saying this is part of our culture, it's good for you, it's being demonized. And
the truth is, of course, just somewhere between those two things,
exactly.
Isn't it? Anecdotally, we can all sort of identify what Macron's getting at. People who are rolling around in the street drunk, more a British problem than a French problem, but nonetheless unlikely to be on wine, but possible. Civilised wine drinking with a meal isn't that, but at the same time, it is alcohol, it isn't good for you.
I think there's an element of snobbery about it. Wine is a middle class drink. Well, middle class people don't get drunk, in that same yobbish way, which of course they do. But I think there's that. But I think what's interesting about this is the health officials calling for a national alcohol plan. And I think it raises a lot of issues which we're seeing in news across the board now about how much governments should try to use tools like taxation and legislation to produce public health advice and to sort of guide our health choices.
Okay, this is the point where, just because this is the week unwrapped, I have to ask you, because the answer to this is normally yes. Have any of you lived in France?
No.
No, is this the first time we're discussing a country you haven't lived in? Okay.
I've never lived
But
in
I
France.
think this is across the board. This isn't just a French issue. England, we're just about to introduce a tax on sugary drinks. That's coming in next month. And there was a story this week about Public Health England are calling on the food industry to cut portion sizes as part of a government drive to reduce calorie consumption. And it provokes extreme reactions.
The link is whether the government should be involved at all in what people knowingly
how
eat
much
and
the
drink that's bad for
government
them.
should have a say on our lifestyle choices. Whether the government has a right to turn around and say to everyone, you should be drinking less, or whether it's like, do you know what, it's up to me.
Felicity.
I don't think it matters either way whether the government wades in or not. I was reading a very interesting article in The Guardian by B. Wilson about bacon and our kind of national obsession with bacon sandwiches and how it actually is really, really bad for our health. And it was back in 2015 where the World Health Organization published this report that said, yes, your risk of cancer is massively increased if you're eating more processed meats. And I remember it at the time. I was working at Newsweek and there was a girl in the office who had to report the story and immediately decided she was going to go vegan, just like that. It was this huge shock. Everyone was talking about it. It was a big thing. But as this article makes clear, like since then, we're all still eating bacon. I think sales have actually completely resurged and no one's going to take the bacon butty away from the Brits. And I think that's really interesting because I think it's all to do with facts, actually, and the idea that very solid health facts actually doesn't matter at all. And
there was also the thing in the YouGov survey this week which just showed like how many people don't know what causes people cancer. So like 50% of Britons think that stress causes cancer, and that's not true. 13% of people think coffee causes cancer, when actually coffee can be seen to help cancer.
Processed meat was irrefutable.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But 75% of the people in this poll thought that cancer was genetic. Played a role.
It can
whereas
be, can't it?
Only 1 in 10 cancers is genetic, whereas
Still 1 in 10.
which is 75. But 9 out
We're
of 10
not playing cancer bingo here. We can say there are
but
lots
I guess,
of causes.
but the point that Felicity's making, and I think I probably agree with, is that actually what you're looking at is what people's perceptions of problems are. And so...
But then doesn't the government play a role in guiding those perceptions? Like, I read the article, the bacon one, it was really interesting, but actually she made the point of research has been showing almost beyond doubt since the 1970s that processed meats, such as bacon, definitely have a link to cancer. But the first official public advice was in 2015, and then it just sort of died down again because the meat industry came back and said, oh, no,
exactly.
it's fine.
It's about industry pressures, isn't it? And that's what links this with Macron. It's not about the government deciding what we consume. It's about the government bowing to the pressures of industries that, for all sorts of reasons, it relies upon and they rely on it. So, I mean, in this country, bacon, ham, pork, processed meat, big industry. Same, isn't it, in France? I mean, wine is a huge industry. But in a way, it would be treacherous of the president to say, don't drink it.
But surely these doctors are saying that Macron has let down the French people by saying that it's safe. And I think there is an argument. Where does the government's duty lie? Is it to keep industry and the economy going, or do they have a duty to sort of to block this advertising? The same when they debranded tobacco packaging. A lot of tobacco companies resisted on the basis of freedom, but smokers are still free to buy tobacco, but the smoking rates have fallen, and that's because they removed the power of advertising from the equation.
There was a really good article in the Financial Times last year called The Problem with Facts by Tim Harford, and I think it was one of the best pieces of journalism of last year. It was all about facts and living in this post-truth era and all that, but he was very much focusing on the tobacco industry and sort of saying that, 1950s, that the huge tobacco giants all met and they were in crisis because all this, reams and reams of science was coming out saying that tobacco is killing you, basically, and they went to this PR firm and said, what on earth are we going to do? And they came up with the most incredible strategy. It was like all these different ways that they were going to fight government, fight science, fight everyone, and it worked. I mean, I know that smoking is much reduced now, but at the time they had decades and decades more in them because they managed to work out a way, and it kind of rested on the idea that facts just don't carry that much weight. And actually, one of the interesting things that the truth can feel threatening, and threatening people tends to backfire. So if you have the government and scientists telling you that your way of life is wrong and your way of life is going to do this, I think people will actually...
Stubborn.
Yeah. And I don't think that, and I think that's what my point in this is, that I don't think the government can really win on this one, because I think A, the meat or the alcohol or the tobacco industries are just too powerful, and B, people aren't going to respond to facts.
I totally agree. I think the government's sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that if they do give this advice, then it's told, you're telling us how to live, you're taxing the things that we want to eat and drink. But if they don't, then people say, well, why didn't you fight back against these industries that are pushing these unhealthy products on us?
But doesn't it also just come down to pleasure? Yes. Like, it's not about
balance,
regulations. I mean, Macron's trying to seem human to French people who do drink wine, typically with lunch and dinner, and just say, I know it's not great for you, but I enjoy it, so do you. We're all going to die one day. What's wrong with that in moderation?
And he's very populist. You know, that's the thing about Macron, is that he's managed to say, I mean, cynically, some people might suggest he deliberately chooses to say the things that he knows will go down well with the majority of people. And this is a clear play to people who do like wine and do want to keep drinking and don't want to have people on their back like Felicity.
But also,
saying.
it is actually a reasonable, rational human response to say, yes, I know there's a small risk that this is not good for my health, but I enjoy it.
But also, I mean, I know this is probably a bit of a French stereotype, but I thought the point with the French is that they were actually right. You had a little bit of wine with your meal. You enjoyed it with food.
Lifestyle.
Yeah, and you knew when to stop. And we're the problem because we're the bingers.
Well,
I kind of thought people would sort of agree with Macron that A, this is a pleasure that I enjoy, and I in my life I get to have some pleasures, and B, it's not that bad for you if you're having a lovely glass of whatever with your, cheese or whatever.
I mean, I thought exactly
Not
the same.
to go for the stereotypes.
In your beret. I thought exactly the same thing, and I was drinking my glass of wine last night as I read about this. But in fact, these doctors who've come out and written this open letter, they came out with these figures that said apparently alcohol kills 50,000 people a year in France, and wine accounts for about 60% of the alcohol consumed there. So, it is having an effect. I'd be interested to see how that stacks up against figures for the UK in terms of how many people each year die as a result of alcohol-related illnesses and bacon sandwiches.
Do we want, I don't know if we want virtuous leaders as well. That's the question, is that it appears to me that Theresa May's morals don't seem to really matter to the general public. And and if they did, the vegan that is Jeremy Corbyn, and he would be winning by loads.
Yeah, and
loads.
running through a wheat field, that was just not going to wash for the public.
And Sarkozy was a teetotaler, so it just shows it proves nothing.
And so is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Food for thought. And Hitler, is that true?
Hitler was a vegetarian, didn't drink alcohol.
Is that right?
That's the main reason
everyone
I'm not a
loved him.
vegetarian.
Well, you can get a lot done. Finally this week, it's Felicity. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's the end of an era.
Well, here we are with NME's godlike genius, Liam Gallagher.
Yeah, here we are.
In terms of being a godlike genius,
Yeah.
does this feel now...
Two godlike geniuses in my family.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And then people wonder why we don't fucking speak. I'm godlike. No, I'm fucking godlike. It fucking says there that I'm godlike, but it says here that I'm fucking godlike as well. Well, I'm a genius. Yeah, well, I'm a fucking genius too. Well, it says there I'm a genius. Well, it fucking says there that I'm a genius. Do you know what I mean? No wonder we don't fucking get on.
Incredibly articulate Liam Gallagher there, speaking to NME writer Jordan Bassett in February. Now, Felicity, the NME announced this week what?
They announced that they're going to cease their print edition of the magazine. So
This some years after they ceased being any good, right? So they had their no, but
Yes, I
I'm not
think
even
that's-
talking about relevant. We'll move on to that. But they ceased their paid-for print edition. They became a free. What do they call it? Free sheet.
Yeah. So they became a freebie magazine in 2015.
Okay, why is that your story of the week? Because, like I say, you could say the NME's been in decline for a while.
It has, but I think there are so many reasons why this is a really, really important story. I think it speaks to the precarious nature of journalism. I think it speaks to music and music industry and the rise of the internet. I think deep down it's just really, really sad for an awful lot of people who are probably, the age 30 and above, who this was a massive part of their youth. And I've just been reading some of the bands and musicians and journalists who have sort of poured out their hearts over the last few days. The Cribs, for me, the Cribs are a huge band, and they've said, we're going to miss the NME. As kids growing up in the north, feeling isolated, it was an important connection to the outside world. They also talked about the journalists. A lot of them were just kids, and a lot of some of the well-known names who sort of made their mark starting out at the NME said, you'd go to the NME, they said, go review this band, write 400 words. And this, triggered some huge careers. And I think it is really, really sad. But I completely agree that the NME had been in a downward spiral for some time.
It's not relevant anymore, is it, Jamie, the NME?
I actually would hugely disagree. Well, no. I'd slightly disagree. I think
If we're going to have an NME-style conversation, you should disagree on a godlike level.
Yeah. I don't think I could do my Liam Gallagher impression. I think that when Jeremy Corbyn was put on the front cover of NME last year in the run-up to the election, that was still relevant. People were talking about it, and I think that was also partly for one of the first times when people were like it was obviously panned in the right-wing press, but it was like people being like, "Oh God, yeah, this is something that's interesting."
But was it relevant to 16 and 17-year-olds who, the Cribs were when they used to read the NME 15 years ago?
No, I know, but so that's an
it's
example.
relevant to the chattering classes and people in their 30s who read it before.
It's an example of people were talking about the NME front cover in a way that they hadn't done in quite a long time when that happened.
It picked up on the zeitgeist of the time, didn't it? In the way it hadn't basically since the 80s, when it lost its niche place as an indie magazine, and it been struggling. My partner worked there for 6 years, and there would be endless debates about what they should be covering and which direction should they be doing, rock or just rock or rap, and it came off the path in the 80s when it lost that niche and never quite got back onto it again.
Well, there was an interesting piece by Alexis Petridis in The Guardian about that, actually. I don't know if you saw it, saying that in his view, maybe had they embraced the fact that music fans were becoming more pluralistic 10 years ago, that it was okay to like the Strokes and Jay-Z, that they might have survived a bit longer.
The problem is then how do they compete against all the other music magazines? What makes them special? They stood on their own for so long as the ultimate indie magazine, music magazine, and it lost that. You can read about musicians in newspapers everywhere. Everyone covers that stuff. It's mainstream. So what did it have to offer?
I agree, and I think it was that Petridis article. I think he said he knew the death knell had been sounded when they had a headline which was Marks and Spencer selling cauliflower steaks for £3 whatever, and he just remembered thinking, oh my God, the NME, this venerable title, this how people would get their music but it wasn't also, I think they started to do sort of news, and it was just sort of reporting on whatever, but the NME, they had really acerbic commentary and opinion.
News,
really opinionated.
And they were tastemakers as well.
You don't need that, do you? Young people, teenagers don't need that.
Not now,
You
because
did.
you've got all these things, but you did.
But my point is, there are no 18-year-olds that are upset about the closure of the NME because they can go on Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube.
They
and
can
just
go on Spotify or Songkick, but are they offering
mates.
the same things that the NME was? I'm not sure Spotify is a worthy replacement for the NME. I agree. I think a lot of 18-year-olds will be like, the NME's gone, who cares? But I think that in itself is really, really telling. Where
they built their own subculture.
All of the people that are talking about how for a 15-year-old in Barnsley or whatever, every Wednesday was being able to be transported into a different world, like a world where you were accepted for who you were and also just for really being excited about being somewhere else. Yeah, I think it's a shame that maybe 15, 16-year-olds now have so much of the world at their fingertips that they don't need a every Wednesday. Like, yes, there's possibly an element of nostalgia and a lot of older people looking back and being like, oh God, it was better in the old days. But there is something romantic about waiting for a magazine to come out on Wednesday to see who's on the front cover.
And there was such excitement. They thought they were going to change the world with music.
That's just because you're all journalists. There isn't that excitement.
It was,
the 16-year-olds you're describing
there was so much.
are not wishing that just once a week a magazine
but there
came out.
was.
But they
there
get
was,
that excitement by seeing who's trending on whatever social media platform they're using.
There's that same sort of we're going to change the world?
Yes.
Can I just give a shout out to the Week Junior kids waiting very eagerly on a Friday for... No, it's true. The Week Junior is doing hugely well, and it just proves that a print title that comes out every Friday, there is still money to be made in that.
There absolutely is, although let's be honest, when your audience reach puberty, they're not necessarily subscribing straight away to the adult version of the week, are they? There's 20 years in between.
Well, it
They'll
remains
go
to be seen.
to the website.
Yeah, go to the website. That's where we come in.
They're listening to us, of course. And actually, moving into periodicals more suited to our esteemed title, The New Statesman, they're now charging a subscription for access to their journalism as well.
Yeah, they put up a paywall, haven't they? The FT were the first ones to pioneer the paywall, and it's a really, really good idea, isn't it? Because you can still get... I think it depends on how high you set but you can get 20 articles without having to pay anything. But then loyal customers would pay for, I think it's a really good idea.
Yeah, the metered paywall is what the New Statesman are doing now, this week, like that they've announced. And that basically gives you 4 free articles a month. Everyone. There was an argument that, so the way that FT have done for a bit is that writers can send out a link that is free. So if writers wanted someone to read it, they've got a special link that means that they can click through and get it. Their New Statesman have said they're not going to do that because they are obviously worried that if you can get it free somewhere, why would you not just continually wait for your favourite writers? Only go to your favourite writers and not read the rest of the site. It is an interesting kind of concept, particularly for journalism now these days, about the paywall, because 10 years ago it was only the Times and the Guardian were like bastions of freedom and saying, you've got to have free content and otherwise we'll never get anywhere. And now 10 years later it looks like the paywall's won.
It looks like the Guardian are actually even considering it. There were reports last year.
Which is no bad thing, because otherwise without the paywall I don't think you're going to have these publications. They're just all going to go.
I agree. It definitely, I think it probably can improve the quality of journalism, but isn't it also a threat in the sense there are some people who just aren't going to pay and they're just not going to read news or good quality news.
They're only going to get their news from theweek.co.uk. Yeah, imagine what a dangerous position that'd put people in.
Disaster.
But I wonder whether that's true, because with things like Spotify and Netflix, you do see people paying for their music or their films if they can see that there's going to be...
We've always had to, and I think there's that mindset of people just aren't, or certainly it's going to take a while before they get into that mindset of being willing to pay for news. It's something we've always had for free.
Of Spotify for journalism. There's this thing called Blendle, which runs in Holland and the US, which is basically like a version of Spotify. So you pay a certain amount and it gives you a month and it gives you access to all of the paywalls within its remit. It hasn't taken off as quickly as perhaps, because it's a great idea, because, 15 years ago, people weren't paying for music, and now nearly everyone I know has a subscription. So the question of how you can get people to that stage, I think partly you have to provide the content that people want. Obviously, the BBC... Amol Rajan did this lecture last week, which got really shared a lot, where he was talking about the future of journalism.
He's the BBC's media
He's the
editor.
BBC's media editor. And he was talking about how the question of how you get people to buy journalism or pay for journalism is actually about creating content that people want to engage with. It's got to be great content, because the BBC are always going to provide some news free, right?
I agree. That's a really good thing. But then is there not also the threat that if you're just tailoring what you cover to your audience, are you actually giving a true version of the world, sort of an objective version of the news, or just playing to the crowd?
Okay, before we disappear any further down this rabbit hole about this very sort of narrow niche thing that we're all interested in, but maybe the general public aren't, why is it such a significant moment now? I understand we've lost the NME. You're sad about that. Other people are putting up paywalls. Maybe that's the future for us. Why does it matter to the world, though, really? Pop culture is still with us. People still read news. So what?
But it's changing. It's a big shift. I think it just shows how much is changing. And I think it's very dismissive to say that people are very sad about this. But it's not just sitting here as journalists. I don't think it's just us. I think, the NME was something that kind of transcended all of that. I think so many kids and so many people, this is how they got their music.
So when people look back in the future at how youth culture stopped existing in little groups of subculture, this will be the moment.
I don't think it stopped existing in little groups of subculture.
No, okay, it's on Facebook groups or whatever, but I mean, it's become even more dispersed and niche, hasn't it? That's, it's hard now to imagine a groundswell like everyone's listening to Blur, everyone's listening to the Libertines, which is what the NME was all about.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. I think things like, you only have to look in the past 2 years, things like grime. You would have never seen Stormzy perform like he did at the Brits 5 to 10 years ago. Like, it just wouldn't have happened. And so that's something that people have taken onto the mainstream, which is a really exciting and good thing and a new thing. And that was driven by young people.
And with that, we close the curtain on this edition of the quality journalism that is freely available at The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity Capon, Jamie Timson and Kari Wilkin. For more from us at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk? That's free. You can also sign up there to our free email newsletter, The Weekday. And don't forget about our special offer, 6 free issues of The Week magazine. You do then have to pay for it. And a free pair of headphones as well when you use the offer code podcast. Just go to dennismags.co.uk/theweek and enter the offer code podcast. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.